When you begin to understand avoidance, you have to start with a simple but often overlooked truth. Emotional suppression doesn't eliminate feeling. It intensifies it. It compresses it. It stores it. And whatever is stored under pressure will eventually find a way out. The mistake most people make is assuming that because an avoidant appears calm, detached, or even indifferent on the surface, there isn't much going on underneath. In reality, the opposite is true. Avoidants are not people who feel less. They are people who have learned, often very early in life, that expressing emotion is unsafe, ineffective, or even dangerous. So, they develop a kind of internal discipline. They regulate, they contain, they manage. Over time, this becomes their identity. Self-sufficient, composed, in control. But that control comes at a cost, because emotions that are not processed don't dissolve. They accumulate. Now, here's where it gets interesting. That accumulated emotional energy doesn't just sit. They're quietly forever an outlet. Somewhere it can be expressed without triggering the fear of vulnerability that the avoidant has spent years trying to avoid. And for many avoidants, sexual connection becomes that outlet. Why? Because sex, unlike emotional intimacy, has structure. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It operates within a defined space where roles, expectations, and boundaries are more predictable. There's a kind of unspoken agreement. We're going to be close, but only in this way and only for this moment. That makes it feel safer. It allows the avoidant to access intensity without feeling like they're losing control of themselves. So when they step into that space, all that suppressed energy, the desire, the passion, the longing, even the tenderness they don't show in daily life can come pouring out. And to the person on the receiving end, it can feel electrifying. It can feel deeper than anything they've experienced before. Encountering isn't just attraction, it's the release of something that has been building for a long time. But here's the part most people don't understand. That intensity is real, but it's not the same as emotional availability. It's not a sign that the avoidant is suddenly open, or ready, or willing to sustain that level of connection outside of that moment. It's simply the one space where their internal guard temporarily lowers. Not because the fear is gone, but because it feels contained. And this creates a powerful illusion. The partner starts to believe this is who they really are. This is what we could be all the time. But for the avoidant, it doesn't work like that. Outside of that controlled environment, the same old defenses come back online. The distance returns. The restraint reappears. And now the contrast between those two states, the intensity and the withdrawal, becomes even more pronounced. This is why people often say avoidants are sexually intense. What they're really witnessing is the overflow of rest emotional energy finding its way through the only channel that feels safe enough to express it. It's not that the avoidant is trying to mislead anyone. It's that they've unconsciously learned to separate where they feel from where they reveal. And if you don't understand that distinction, you'll keep misreading the signal. Take intensity as invitation, passion as promise, and moments as meaning something they were never designed to sustain. Because at the end of the day, intensity without integration doesn't create connection. It creates confusion. Now, building on that, you start to see why sex for an avoidant becomes more than just physical. It becomes strategic. Not in a manipulative sense, but in a deeply psychological one. It is one of the few spaces where they can engage in closeness without triggering the same level of internal threat that emotional intimacy does. And that distinction changes everything. Because for most people, vulnerability is primarily emotional. About being seen, being known, being exposed in your fears, your needs, your insecurities. That kind of openness carries uncertainty. It invites judgment, rejection, and for someone with an avoidant pattern, the terrifying possibility of losing autonomy. So they instinctively guard against it. They keep conversations surface level. They deflect. They withdraw when things get too real. But sex operates differently. It offers a version of vulnerability that is embodied rather than verbal, immediate rather than prolonged. You're present, you're engaged, but you're not necessarily explaining yourself. You're not unpacking your history or revealing your inner world in a way that feels permanent or binding. It's contained. It's time limited. And most importantly, it can be entered and exited on their terms. That sense of control is critical because control for an avoidant equals safety. So what happens is this. They allow themselves to be full present in that moment. Sometimes even more. present than people who are emotionally expressive in other areas of life. Their focus sharpens, their energy concentrates. And to the other person, it can feel like an extraordinary level of connection. Like this person is completely here with me. And in that moment, they are. But presence is not the same as openness. This is where the confusion begins, because the partner interprets that presence as a sign of emotional closeness. They think if they can be this connected here, then surely they can be this connected everywhere. The rules are different. The connection exists within a boundary. It's almost like a compartment. Intimacy is allowed here, but it doesn't automatically extend beyond it. And when the moment ends, so does the access. Now, the avoidant returns to their default state, regulated, self-contained, emotionally guarded. Not because the connection wasn't meaningful, but because sustaining that level openness outside of a controlled environment feels overwhelming. It threatens their sense of independence, their internal balance. So they pull back, often without fully understanding why themselves. And this creates a psychological whiplash for the partner. One moment they're experiencing intensity, closeness, even what feels like emotional fusion. The next, they're met with distance, silence, or ambiguity.
Naturally, they try to bridge that gap.
They ask for clarity, for consistency, for more. But the more they push for emotional continuity, the more the avoidant feels that familiar pressure, and the more they retreat. So, you end up with this paradox. The very space where the avoidant seems most open is actually the space that allows them to remain emotionally protected. It's vulnerability, but on a leash. It's closeness, but with an exit strategy built in. And unless you understand that dynamic, you'll keep trying to translate physical intensity into emotional commitment. You will assume that what happens in those moments reflects a broader redeem. SS for connection, when in reality, it may be the only place that level of connection feels tolerable to them. That doesn't make it fake. It makes it specific. And once you see that, you stop chasing consistency where there was never meant to be continuity. And you start recognizing the difference between someone who can access connection and someone who can sustain it. And once you understand that distinction, the next layer becomes impossible to ignore. The rhythm of connection itself. Because with avoidance, it's rarely stable or linear. It's cyclical. There's a pattern, a kind of emotional tide that moves in and out. And if you're not aware of it, you'll experience it as unpredictability. But underneath that unpredictability is a very consistent mechanism. The push-pull dynamic. At a distance, the avoidant feels safe. There's space, autonomy, no pressure to perform emotionally. Interesting happens. Their natural desire begins to reemerge. They start to feel curiosity again, attract, on again, even longing. Because desire for them often requires absence. It needs room to breathe, so they move closer. And when they do, it can feel sudden, even intense. They initiate contact. They engage more deeply. And often that energy expresses itself most powerfully in physical connection. The chemistry feels heightened, the attraction amplified. But what you're really witnessing is the release of tension that was built during the period of distance. It's reactive. Now, here's the critical part. As that closeness increases, so does their internal discomfort. Because while one part of them is drawn in, another part is scanning for threat. The threat of dependency, of expectation, of losing control over their own emotional state. And the closer they get, the louder that internal alarm becomes. So they pull away.
Not always dramatically.
Sometimes it is subtle. Slower responses, less engagement, a shift in tone. Other times it's abrupt, but the effect is the same. Distance is right.
Established. And in that distance, they regulate again.
They return to themselves. Pressure subsides. But now something else begins to build on both sides. For the avoidant, the space restores their sense of safety. And with it, their desire slowly returns. For the partner, the sudden withdrawal creates confusion, even anxiety. They start questioning what changed, what they did, what it all meant. And in that emotional gap, the connection takes on more weight. The absence amplifies the memory of intensity. So, when the avoidant comes back, and they often do, the reconnection feels even stronger than before. There's relief. There's excitement. There's a sense of we're back. And once again, that energy often channels into sexual intensity because it's the quickest way to collapse the distance without having to process the emotional gap that created it. This is why the dynamic can feel addictive. You're not just responding to the person, you're responding to the cycle. The contrast bet. Wean absence and presence, distance and closeness creates emotional spikes that the brain begins to associate with passion. But it's not stability, it's oscillation. And most people aren't prepared for that because what they're looking for is continuity, a steady deepening of connection where intimacy builds over time. But with an avoidant operating in this pattern, intimacy doesn't build in a straight line. It surges, retreats, and resurfaces. And unless both people are aware of what's happening, it creates a loop where one chases clarity while the other seeks space. The danger is in mislabeling the experience, calling it chemistry when it's actually contrast, calling it depth when it's intensity created by absence, because the body doesn't always know the difference. It just feels the high. But real connection isn't measured by how powerful the moment are when you come together. It's measured by what remains consistent when you're not in those moments, because if closeness only exists, after distance and intensity only shows up after withdrawal, then what you're experiencing isn't balance, it's a cycle. And when you look even deeper into that cycle, you begin to understand something that can be easily misunderstood if you're only looking at behavior on the surface, because what often gets labeled as dominance, control, or intensity in an avoidant sexual expression is not always about power over another person. It's about protection of self. At the core of the avoidant pattern is a very specific fear, the fear of being emotionally engulfed, not just hurt, not just rejected, but absorbed to the point where they lose their sense of independence, their internal stability, their identity. For them, closeness isn't connection. It carries the risk of disappearance. And that fear doesn't switch off when intimacy becomes physical. It simply changes form. So, what do? They find ways to stay engaged while still maintaining a sense of control. And one of the most effective ways to do that is by influencing the pace, the structure, and the intensity of the interaction itself. You'll often notice this not as something overtly declared, but as something subtly directed. They set the rhythm. They escalate or slow things down. They decide when to deepen the moment and when to pull it back. And again, this isn't necessarily conscious manipulation. It's an unconscious strategy to stay connected without feeling overwhelmed, because control in this context is regulation. If they can guide the experience, they can participate in it without losing themselves in it. If they can determine the boundaries, they can explore intensity without crossing into vulnerability that feels unmanageable. It allows them to hover right at the edge of closeness, close enough to feel something real, but not so close that it threatens their sense of autonomy. And to a partner, this can feel incredibly compelling. There's a confidence in it, a certainty. It creates a sense of of being led into an experience that feels intentional and focused. But at the same time, there can be an undercurrent that's harder to articulate, a feeling that something is being held back, that the connection, while intense, isn't entirely mutual in its openness. This is where many people get conflicted because part of them is drawn to the intensity, the clarity, the decisiveness of the moment, and another part of them senses the asymmetry, that while the physical experience may feel shared, the emotional exposure is not equal. And if that imbalance goes unrecognized, it can lead to a subtle but important shift in the dynamic. The partner begins to lean in more, seeking to match the depth they believe they've already touched, trying to access the same level of openness outside of that space. But the avoidant, sensing that shift, feels the pressure rising again and instinctively tightens their grip on control or withdraws altogether. So, what looked like passion begins to reveal TS, underlying structure, a carefully managed experience where intensity is allowed, but only within limits that protect the avoidant from emotional overwhelm. Now, this doesn't mean the experience is inauthentic. The presence is real, but it's filtered through a need to maintain self-boundaries at all costs. And that filtering is what makes it difficult for many people to fully relax into it, even when it feels powerful, because true intimacy isn't about how deeply you can feel in a moment. It's about how safely you can exist without needing to control the moment. And when control becomes the condition for connection, what you're left with is not surrender, but strategy. And this is where the misunderstanding reaches its peak, because by now the experience has created a very convincing narrative in the mind of the partner. The intensity has been felt. The presence has been undeniable. The moments have carried a kind of emotional charge that feels too powerful to dismiss.
So, naturally, that
The conclusion becomes this must mean something deeper. But that assumption is exactly where things begin to unravel, because most people are wired to interpret intensity as depth. If something feels strong, immersive, almost consuming, we instinctively assign it meaning. We believe it reflects emotional investment, that it signals a level of care, attachment, or even love. And in many cases, that interpretation works because in more secure dynamics, emotional and physical intimacy tend to align. They reinforce each other. But with an avoidant, that alignment is often fractured. What you're experiencing in those heightened moments is not necessarily a window into their emotional world. It's a release valve. It's an expression of energy that has been contained, structured, and allowed to emerge under very specific conditions. And because it feels so real, so present, it creates the illusion that you've accessed something continuous, something that exists beyond the moment itself. So, you were born, egging to build a story around it. You replay the connection. You analyze the details. You look for consistency between what was felt and how they behave afterward. And when those two things don't match, when the intensity isn't followed by clarity, when the closeness isn't followed by emotional availability, you don't immediately question the assumption. Instead, you question yourself. Did I misread it? Did I expect too much? Was it real? And this is where the emotional trap forms, because instead of recognizing the structural difference in how intimacy is experienced, you internalize the inconsistency as something you need to solve. You try to earn continuity from moments that were never designed to extend beyond themselves, constructed. From their perspective, the experience was genuine, but it was also contained. It existed fully in that moment without the implication that it would automatically translate into ongoing emotional openness. So, when you seek to deepen or define it, they feel a shift not because you've done something wrong, but because you're moving the interaction into a space that feels less controlled, less predictable. And that's where they begin to retreat. Now, you're left holding two conflicting realities. One is what you felt, intensity, connection, something that seemed undeniably meaningful. The other is what you're receiving, distance, ambiguity, a lack of emotional follow-through. And the mind struggles to reconcile those two because it wants coherence. It wants a clear cause and effect. But the truth is, the intensity was never a promise. It was an experience. And once you begin to see that distinction, something shifts. You stop using those moments as evidence of what relationship is becoming, and you start seeing them for what they actually are. Isolated expressions that don't necessarily reflect a broader emotional trajectory. This doesn't mean they're empty. It means they're specific. And the more you confuse specificity with continuity, the more you'll find yourself trying to stretch a moment into a meaning it was never built to carry, because at the end of the day, intensity can feel like truth, but without consistency, it's just a moment that hasn't learned how to last. And when you take all of this together, the suppression, the controlled vulnerability, the push-pull rhythm, the need for control, and the misinterpretation of intensity, you begin to see why most people struggle to handle this dynamic. It's not because they're weak, and it's not because the avoidant is intentionally difficult. It's because the entire structure of the connection operates on a different logic than what most people are prepared for. Most individuals enter relationships with an expectation of progression. They believe that as connection deepens, consistency increases, that emotional intimacy will grow alongside physical closeness, that if something feels powerful, it will naturally stabilize over time. In other words, they're looking for a linear experience, one where each step forward builds on the last. But with an avoidant, the experience isn't linear, it's contradictory. You're dealing with someone who can be intensely present and deeply engaged in one moment, and then distant, detached, or ambiguous in the next. And not because their feelings are false, but because their capacity to sustain those feelings in an open, unguarded way is limited. So what you get is a series of peaks without a stable baseline. And that's where the emotional strain begins, because to stay grounded in that kind of dynamic, you have to hold two opposing truths at the same time. You have to accept that the intensity is real, but not predictive, that connection exists, but isn't consistently accessible, that what you feel in those moments doesn't necessarily define what the relationship is outside of them. Most people aren't equipped to do that, at least not without losing themselves in the process. So they adapt in ways that slowly erode their own stability. They become hyperaware, trying to read subtle shifts in behavior. They overanalyze interactions, looking for clues about where they stand. They either lean in harder, hoping to create consistency through effort, or they start to withdraw defensively, trying to protect themselves from the emotional swings. And in both cases, they move further away from their own center because the focus shifts from, is this dynamic, healthy, and sustainable for me, to how do I make this work? And that question, while understandable, often leads to self-abandonment. You begin negotiating your needs, tolerating inconsistency, and justifying behavior that, in a different context, you would accept. And this is the real reason most people can't handle avoidance at this level of intensity. It's not the intensity itself. It's the lack of integration. It's the absence of continuity between moments of closeness and the reality of everyday connection. Without that continuity, the relationship becomes emotionally disorienting. Now, this doesn't mean that every connection with an avoidant is doomed or unworkable, but it does mean that without awareness on both sides, there's a high risk of imbalance because one person ends up adapting to the cycle while the other remains protected by it. And over time, that imbalance becomes unsustainable. So, the question isn't whether you can handle the intensity. Many people can. The real question is whether you can remain anchored in yourself while experiencing it, whether you can appreciate what's real in the moment without assigning it a meaning it can't consistently uphold. Whether you can recognize the difference between connection that excites you and connection that supports you, because those are not always the same thing.
And if you don't make that distinction,
You'll keep chasing moments that feel powerful while slowly losing the stability that actually makes connection last. Because in the end,
it's not the intensity you can't hand.
It's the inconsistency you were never meant to normalize.
And when you step back and look at the entire picture, something becomes very clear. Avoidants are not confusing because they lack depth. They're confusing because their depth is fragmented. It shows up in moments, in intensity, in controlled environments where they feel safe enough to let it surface. But what most people are searching for isn't just depth in moments, they're searching for continuity across time. It's easy to get pulled into something that feels powerful, rare, almost magnetic, but intensity by itself is not foundation. It doesn't build trust. It doesn't create stability. And it certainly doesn't guarantee emotional availability. What it does is create an experience, one that can feel incredibly real, but not necessarily reliable. So the real question you have to ask yourself is not, did it feel strong? The real question is, can it be sustained? Because a connection that only exists in peaks will eventually leave you depleted in the valleys. This is where awareness becomes your greatest advantage. When you understand the psychology behind the behavior, you stop personalizing the inconsistency. You stop trying to earn clarity from someone who hasn't yet developed the capacity to offer it consistently. And most importantly, you stop abandoning your own needs in order to hold on to moments that don't extend beyond themselves. And that's not about rejecting the other person, it's about choosing alignment over illusion, because real connection isn't just about how deeply someone can with you in a moment, it's about how consistently they can meet you in reality. It's about emotional presence that doesn't disappear when the moment ends. It's about safety, not just intensity. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't measure connection by how high it takes you, measure it by how steady it holds you. Because at the end of the day, what you can build with someone will always matter, more than what you can feel with them in power.